Before the billion-dollar empire, the private jets, the Basquiat paintings, and the luxury penthouses, there was a teenager standing on the dangerous streets of Brooklyn during America's crack epidemic. Long before the world knew Jay-Z as hip-hop's first billionaire, Shawn Carter was learning how power really worked. But unlike most people around him, he understood one thing early. The real goal was never fame. It was ownership. And that single mindset would eventually transform him from a street hustler into one of the most powerful businessmen in modern entertainment. Now, number 1. The streets that created Jay-Z. Long before the billionaire boardrooms, private art collections, and luxury estates, Jay-Z was just another kid trying to survive inside one of the most dangerous environments in America. To understand how Shawn Carter became hip-hop's first billionaire, you first have to understand the world that created him. Because this story does not begin with music. It begins in the Marcy houses of Brooklyn during the 1970s and 1980s. A period when New York was collapsing under crime, poverty, and the crack epidemic. Entire neighborhoods were trapped in cycles of violence and economic desperation. Factories disappeared, jobs vanished, families broke apart. And for many young black teenagers growing up in public housing, survival became the only realistic ambition. For Shawn Carter, that reality arrived early. His father abandoned the family when he was still a child, leaving his mother, Gloria Carter, to raise 4 children alone inside the Marcy projects. Money was always limited, opportunities were rare, and outside the apartment windows was a street economy moving faster than the legal one. In many neighborhoods across America, children grew up dreaming of becoming doctors, lawyers, or athletes. In Marcy, kids grew up watching drug dealers drive luxury cars. That difference mattered. The streets of Brooklyn during that era created a completely different understanding of success. Young men who controlled money on the streets commanded respect, fear, and influence. Expensive jewelry, designer clothes, and flashy cars became symbols of power in communities where power itself was scarce. And Shawn Carter was paying attention. Unlike many people around him, he developed a reputation for being quiet, observant, and unusually strategic. Friends who knew him during those early years often described him as someone who studied people carefully. Even before fame, he understood how systems worked, who had influence, who controlled money, and how reputation could become currency. Eventually, like many teenagers around him, he entered the drug trade. Years later, Jay-Z would openly admit that selling crack exposed him to danger, paranoia, and violence. But he also explained something else that most people overlooked. The streets taught him business psychology before corporate America ever did. Risk and reward, supply and demand, cash flow, negotiation, competition, brand image, customer loyalty. In many ways, the same mindset that later helped him build billion-dollar companies was already developing during those years in Brooklyn. The environment was dangerous, but it trained him to think several moves ahead. And unlike many hustlers who became consumed by street life, Shawn Carter saw it differently. To him, the streets were never the final destination. They were temporary, a stepping stone, a way out. That distinction would eventually separate him from countless others, because while many people around him were trapped in survival mode, Jay-Z was quietly developing ambition far beyond Brooklyn. Music became the first real glimpse of escape. As a teenager, he began battling other rappers and building a reputation for his lyrical ability. But even then, his style was different from most artists emerging at the time. His lyrics were calculated, detailed, and heavily influenced by the economics of street life. He didn't just rap about violence or status. He rapped about strategy, about power, about money. And slowly, people started noticing. But the music industry of the late 1980s and early 1990s was not exactly welcoming to unknown rappers from Brooklyn. Major labels controlled everything. Radio access, distribution, marketing, exposure, all of it flowed through powerful executives who decided which artists deserved opportunities. For many aspiring rappers, rejection was the end of the story. For Jay-Z, rejection became motivation, because by then, Shawn Carter had already learned one of the most important lessons of his life from the streets. If nobody opens the door for you, build your own entrance. That mentality would soon change not only his own future, but the future of hip-hop business forever. And in the next chapter, a young hustler from Brooklyn would make a decision that transformed him from an underground rapper into the architect of an independent empire called Roc-A-Fella Records. 2. Building Roc-A-Fella from nothing. By the mid-1990s, the music industry had already decided who mattered, and Jay-Z was not on that list. Major labels dismissed him repeatedly. Some executives believed he was too old to become a new artist. Others thought his music sounded too sophisticated for mainstream radio. At a time when hip-hop was becoming louder, flashier, and easier to commercialize, Jay-Z's style felt calculated and unapologetically street. But Shawn Carter had spent years surviving in environments where rejection meant nothing. The streets had already taught him a brutal truth. Nobody was coming to save him. So instead of waiting for a record deal, he built his own company. In 1995, alongside Damon and Kareem Burke, Jay-Z co-founded Roc-A-Fella Records, an independent label created out of pure necessity. At the time, the idea sounded almost ridiculous. 3 young men from Brooklyn with limited industry connections were attempting to compete against billion-dollar music corporations that controlled radio stations, retail distribution, television exposure, and artist promotion. But what made Roc-A-Fella dangerous was not money. It was mindset. Unlike many artists chasing fame, Jay-Z approached music like a businessman entering a new market. He understood branding instinctively. Everything surrounding Roc-A-Fella was designed to project ambition, exclusivity, and power. The music, the visuals, the fashion, the interviews, all of it communicated one message. This was not just rap, this was luxury. At a time when many rappers focused primarily on street credibility, Jay-Z introduced something different into hip-hop culture: aspirational wealth. Expensive suits, champagne, luxury cars, high-end watches, elite lifestyles. He presented success not just as survival, but as elevation. And audiences responded immediately. But behind the image was relentless hustle. Without major label backing, Jay-Z and his partners handled much of the early promotion themselves. They distributed CDs manually, pushed records through independent channels, and built relationships street by street, club by club, DJ by DJ. Stories from that era describe them loading car trunks with albums and personally moving products across New York. It was entrepreneurship disguised as rap promotion. And slowly, the momentum started building. Then came Reasonable Doubt. Released in 1996, the album would eventually become one of the most respected hip-hop projects of all time. But at the time, commercial success was far from guaranteed. The album was deeply lyrical, reflective, and sophisticated. Jay-Z rapped less like an entertainer and more like a man documenting the psychology of ambition, wealth, paranoia, and survival. The project sounded expensive, not because of money, but because of perspective. Songs referenced luxury brands, upscale living, organized business thinking, and calculated risk-taking in ways hip-hop had rarely seen before. Jay-Z wasn't presenting himself as reckless. He was presenting himself as strategic. That image became his greatest weapon. Because while other artists built celebrity, Jay-Z was building mythology. And unlike many rappers who signed away ownership for short-term fame, Roc-A-Fella gave Jay-Z something far more valuable: control, ownership over his music, ownership over his image, ownership over his future. That decision would later become one of the most important financial moves of his entire career. As Roc-A-Fella expanded, Jay-Z's influence inside hip-hop grew rapidly. Albums sold, partnerships formed, industry executives who once ignored him suddenly wanted meetings. The same system that rejected him now saw him as one of the most commercially valuable figures in music. But success introduced a new realization. Jay-Z began to understand that even the wealthiest entertainers were still operating inside systems controlled by larger corporations. Record labels, distributors, fashion companies, liquor brands, media networks. The real power often belonged to the people who owned the infrastructure behind celebrity culture. And Shawn Carter was paying attention again. He had already conquered survival in Brooklyn. Now he wanted something bigger, corporate power. Because for Jay-Z, music was never supposed to be the final destination. It was leverage. And in the next chapter, the rapper from Marcy Projects would begin transforming himself into something far more dangerous than a music star, a businessman capable of entering America's corporate elite. Number 3. Turning fame into corporate power. By the early 2000s, Jay-Z had already achieved what most artists only dream of: platinum records, global recognition, and a dominant position in hip-hop. But behind the success, Shawn Carter was beginning to see something deeper. Fame was powerful, but it was also limited. Because fame could make you rich, but it could not always make you free. At the center of this realization was a simple truth about the music industry. The real money was not in the artists. It was in the systems that controlled the artists. Distribution, publishing, marketing pipelines, brand ownership, corporate partnerships, and Jay-Z began to shift his thinking accordingly. This was the beginning of his transformation from rapper into executive. One of the most defining moments of this transition came when he stepped into the upper levels of the music industry itself, eventually taking on leadership roles at Def Jam Recordings. For a man who once sold CDs out of car trunks in Brooklyn, entering corporate boardrooms represented a completely different world. One governed not by street rules, but by contracts, negotiations, and long-term leverage. And Jay-Z adapted quickly. Inside those rooms, he was no longer just an artist asking for opportunities. He was now part of the decision-making structure, shaping which artists were signed, how albums were marketed, and how the business of hip-hop was being structured at a global level. But what made him different from traditional executives was perspective. He still understood the artist's mindset. He still understood the streets. And more importantly, he understood branding better than most corporate leaders in the room. While others saw music as a product line, Jay-Z saw it as identity. He understood that modern entertainment was not just about selling songs. It was about selling lifestyle, aspiration, and emotional connection. Every album rollout, every public appearance, every collaboration became part of a larger narrative. The evolution of Shawn Carter into a symbol of success. At the same time, he began expanding beyond music. Fashion became one of his earliest experiments in diversification. Streetwear collaborations and brand partnerships were not just side projects, they were strategic entries into a larger ecosystem of consumer influence. Jay-Z recognized something early that many artists ignored. Real wealth was built through ownership of brands, not just participation in them. And so his focus gradually shifted, from earnings to equity, from fame to assets, from attention to infrastructure. This mindset marked a critical turning point. Because while most celebrities spent money to maintain an image of success, Jay-Z began investing in systems that could generate wealth independently of his music career. He studied how corporations operated, how CEOs made decisions, how billionaires structured ownership. And slowly, he began applying those principles to his own career. The result was a hybrid identity, part artist, part executive, part strategist. And this is where his influence started expanding beyond hip-hop. Business leaders began to see him differently, not just as a performer, but as a partner. Someone who understood both culture and capital. Someone who could bridge two worlds that rarely intersected, street influence and corporate America. But even as his status grew, Jay-Z was not satisfied. Because he had begun to recognize a ceiling within traditional entertainment success. Artists could become wealthy. Executives could become powerful. But very few people ever became both. And that distinction mattered. It meant that even at the highest levels of success, control was still incomplete. So he began preparing for the next evolution. One that would move him beyond music entirely and into the world of luxury brands, global investments, and institutional wealth, where ownership was not symbolic, it was structural. And in the next chapter, Jay-Z would begin building the foundations of what would eventually become a billionaire blueprint. One that transformed him from a celebrity executive into a global business force operating in champagne, streaming, art, and high-end investments. Number 4. The Billionaire Blueprint. By the late 2000s, Jay-Z was no longer operating like a traditional celebrity. He was thinking like an investor. The shift was subtle at first. Most people still saw him as a rapper with successful side businesses, but behind the scenes, Shawn Carter was quietly building something far more powerful, a diversified portfolio designed to create long-term wealth far beyond music. And unlike many entertainers who chased quick endorsement money, Jay-Z focused on ownership. That single decision changed everything. One of the clearest examples was his involvement with Armand de Brignac, the luxury champagne brand instantly recognizable by its metallic bottles and elite image. In hip-hop culture, champagne had long been associated with status and celebration. But Jay-Z understood something deeper. The real power was not in advertising luxury products, it was in owning them. After publicly distancing himself from other champagne companies, he strategically aligned himself with Armand de Brignac and helped transform it into one of the most recognizable luxury alcohol brands in entertainment culture. What looked like celebrity promotion on the surface was actually a sophisticated branding operation. Jay-Z was attaching exclusivity to identity. And it worked. The brand became synonymous with wealth, nightlife, prestige, and high society. Years later, when part of the company was sold to luxury giant LVMH, it confirmed what many had started realizing. Jay-Z was no longer simply participating in luxury culture. He was entering the luxury industry itself. But champagne was only one piece of a much larger strategy. Another major move came with Tidal. At the time, streaming was rapidly transforming the music business, and artists were increasingly losing control over how their work generated revenue. Most musicians adapted to the system. Jay-Z attempted to challenge it. When he acquired Tidal, many critics questioned the decision. Competing against massive technology companies seemed risky, even unrealistic. But once again, his thinking extended beyond short-term profits. Ownership of platforms meant ownership of distribution. And ownership of distribution meant leverage. Even when the platform faced criticism, the move revealed how Jay-Z viewed business. He was no longer chasing individual paychecks. He wanted control over ecosystems. At the same time, his investments expanded into real estate, technology, entertainment, sports management, and high-end art collecting. Reports of multi-million-dollar Basquiat paintings, luxury properties, and elite investment circles began surrounding his public image. But none of this was accidental. Jay-Z had started studying how old money families preserved wealth across generations. The ultra-wealthy rarely depended on a single industry. Instead, they built interconnected assets that continued generating influence regardless of economic changes. And slowly, Shawn Carter began positioning himself the same way. This was the moment where his identity truly evolved. Not a rapper, not executive, but capitalist. And perhaps the most fascinating part of Jay-Z's rise was how naturally he navigated spaces that once seemed completely inaccessible to someone from the Marcy projects. Boardrooms, billionaire investment circles, luxury auctions, corporate negotiations. He moved through them with the same confidence he once carried on the streets of Brooklyn. Because underneath the tailored suits and billion-dollar deals, the mindset remained the same. Observe the system, understand leverage, control ownership, move strategically. That philosophy eventually helped him achieve something no hip-hop artist had officially accomplished before: billionaire status. But the number itself was almost symbolic. Because for Jay-Z, becoming a billionaire was never just about money. It represented entry into a completely different level of power. A level where influence could shape industries, culture, politics, and legacy itself. And by this point, Jay-Z had become something much larger than a musician. He had become a case study in modern wealth creation. But perhaps his greatest impact was still ahead, because in the next chapter, Jay-Z would do something even more significant than building personal fortune. He would redefine how an entire generation of artists, entrepreneurs, and Black creatives viewed ownership, influence, and legacy forever. Now, Chapter 5: Becoming Cultural Royalty. By the time Jay-Z officially became hip-hop's first billionaire, the achievement represented far more than personal success. It marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. Because before Jay-Z, many rappers viewed wealth as something temporary. Fast money, luxury purchases, record sales, and celebrity lifestyles designed to prove they had escaped poverty. But Jay-Z changed the conversation completely. He introduced the idea that artists could own their music, own companies, own brands, own equity, own influence, and perhaps most importantly, own their future. That shift permanently altered the psychology of hip-hop culture. Suddenly, younger artists were no longer just chasing hit records. They were studying contracts, building businesses, launching brands, investing in technology, and thinking about generational wealth. The blueprint Jay-Z created became larger than music itself, and as his influence expanded, so did his status within American culture. His marriage to Beyoncé transformed them into something rarely seen in modern entertainment. A cultural power couple operating at the intersection of music, fashion, luxury, and business. Together, they became symbols of Black excellence on a global scale, not just because of celebrity, but because of ownership and influence. By this point, Jay-Z was no longer moving like a rapper. He was moving like legacy wealth, private art collections, high-level political relationships, luxury investments, philanthropy, business acquisitions. His world had become almost unrecognizable from the Marcy projects where the story began. And yet, part of what made his rise so compelling was that he never fully separated himself from that history. Jay-Z continued referencing Brooklyn, the streets, and the lessons of survival throughout his career. Not to glorify them, but to explain the mindset they created. Because the truth is, Jay-Z's greatest skill was never music alone. It was an adaptation. He adapted from street hustler to independent artist, from artist to executive, from executive to investor, and from investor to cultural institution. Very few people in entertainment history have managed to evolve through that many worlds successfully. Most become trapped inside the identity that first made them famous. Jay-Z kept reinventing himself, and that reinvention became the foundation of his empire. But perhaps his most important contribution was psychological. For generations, wealth had often felt distant or inaccessible within hip-hop culture, something controlled by corporations, executives, and industries outside the community itself. Jay-Z challenged that idea directly. He proved that someone born inside public housing in Brooklyn could eventually sit at the same tables as billionaires, CEOs, and global investors without abandoning his identity in the process. That symbolism mattered. Because in many ways, Jay-Z's rise was not just about becoming rich. It was about changing what people believed was possible. Today, his influence can be seen everywhere. In artists demanding ownership, in athletes building investment portfolios, in entertainers launching billion-dollar brands, in young entrepreneurs studying equity instead of only income. The culture itself evolved because the blueprint evolved. And perhaps that is the real reason Jay-Z's story continues to resonate so deeply. Not because he escaped poverty, not because he became famous, not even because he became a billionaire, but because he transformed survival instincts developed on the streets of Brooklyn into one of the most powerful business empires modern entertainment has ever seen. A hustler who became a mogul, a rapper who became an institution, and a young man from Marcy houses who ultimately turned ownership into immortality. And in many ways, that is what separates Jay-Z from most celebrities of his era. While others focused on staying relevant, he focused on staying valuable. Relevance fades with time, trends, and public attention. But ownership, investments, and influence can survive for generations. That long-term mindset ultimately allowed him to transcend music completely and enter a category reserved for only a tiny group of people. Individuals whose names no longer represent careers alone, but entire empires. From the streets of Brooklyn to billionaire boardrooms, Jay-Z didn't just build wealth. He changed how an entire generation thinks about power, ownership, and legacy. And maybe that's the real lesson behind his story. The people who truly change the game are never satisfied with simply participating in it. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you leave us a like, subscribe to Black Status, and let us know in the comments which billionaire story we should cover next.